All right. So welcome. Thank you, Rob. This is the second time now I've interviewed you about this book series. Yeah.
That's so cool. It's good to
Yeah.
be back.
Well, good. And so when we talked about your first book about a year ago, you said noon yay. And I remember in the interview, I was like, I thought it was noon yeah. Am I wrong? And then in this book, you talk about how it's is it Noonye or Noonye for the name of the main character. So I'm glad you resolved that tension within me, at least.
I mean, it feels like I think the first 100 pages of the book, this recurring, how is it pronounced? Where did it come from? She learns that she gave it to herself. Then she learns that it's a misunderstanding of some guy with an accent who was
Uh-huh.
going door to door selling yaks. Oh,
It
just the
was
gift that
awesome.
keeps on giving.
The gift that keeps on giving. Yeah, I will say. So this new book, Where'd You Park Your Spaceship? 2. I read this in probably less than a week, and I just kind of carried it with me. And for this one, I actually brought a highlighter, and I just highlighted like whole sections. If you can tell, this was just a fun. It was a fun read, but I love philosophy, so I saw some stuff dropped in there all throughout, and that was really interesting. But I'm kind of curious, how long did it take you to write it?
Well, when I was writing book one, right away in the writing of book one, I was like, oh, yeah, yeah, I know what book two is.
Okay.
So I was carrying it around and knowing, oh, Nunez is going to be so opaque and
Uh,
so historyless that Heen starts to go, you have to have come from somewhere. You have to have
right.
some sort of personal history. You connect with everybody, but it's like a mirage because you don't give one detail. We know you're historyless. Um, so that became really compelling to me. So I gradually had a growing sense of who she was and where she came from, and so that I wrote this book this year.
This year. Okay.
Yeah.
And but did you wake up in the middle of the night like the first one with that dream of where'd you park your spaceship? Did that happen again this way?
It happened beginning in during the writing of book one. I began to see the beats. It's like you see
Oh, yeah.
major, like I could, some of it's, and sometimes it's a very specific scene and sometimes it's a feeling. So
Mhm.
I was like, oh, she's from a planet. It's like isolated and lonely.
Yeah.
It's like a planet that no one ever wanted to even live on. Okay, okay, great. What's it called? Meeps. Oh, it's got cracks. Of course, it's got cracks.
Of course it's got
There's
cracks.
this valley, and she's got this person who kind of is a caretaker, but not really. Who seems to be
Yeah.
missing a social chip. But then you're going to actually learn about this person. So that's sometimes it's a specific. Oh, and then I remember thinking, oh, and then she ends up like becoming like a plumber at like age
Yes.
8. So sometimes I'll get yeah, she starts like getting farmed out for like terrible jobs kind of.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, got it. Um, so I'll get like that. Sometimes it's a specific thing like that, or sometimes it's a particular feeling. And then there was also things like the bread speech scene in book one, where
Yes.
she speaks to the
Uh-huh.
students. So then there's also things that happen like, how did she become somebody who could do that?
Hmm.
So there are these things that aren't as conscious as they are almost unconscious. Of there were moments in writing this book where I would smile, I would laugh and be like, good. That helps me understand how she became the person.
Ah,
So when she does
right.
the pull-up thing, the pull-up contest, but
Pull
she
up
sort of
contest.
starts performing
Hmm.
and she like hangs by one arm and then she's like, oh, do I have to do two arms? Like
Right.
she starts messing with it. You're seeing her grow in her ability. She's like learning how to You're like learning how she becomes Nunez, essentially.
Yeah. That was a great showdown scene. And I can see how it kind of had some echoes with the when she's up on stage in the first one.
Yes.
And I saw different aspects of like here's someone who's still, I mean, she's still going through life but still learning about herself along the way. And it's so obvious because there's all these discoveries that we do along the way that we start realizing
Yeah.
like did you watch the show Lost as it was happening?
I lost it afterwards. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And there's always those episodes that go back and explain a character's behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's why they say it that way. That's why they hate that. So,
And it's so satisfying to get backstory.
oh, absolutely. And then it
Oh,
helps you almost to
satisfying.
predict what they might do in the future. So you feel like you know them, but then they still surprise you. So I
Yeah,
wrote down, go ahead.
I had a friend of mine made that show, Lost, and
Oh,
he and
yeah.
I made a show that we sold in 2011. So I got to sit with him
Hmm.
and Carlton, and as we were writing the script that we sold, watch him do that like the questions he asked
Oh, I
and
see.
the discussions we had about backstory that weren't even in the script we wrote, and watching him be both here but also how did this character end up here, and
Right.
what do we show of how this character became who they are, and what do we not show right now. But I got to watch and sit with him and like watch a master do exactly what you're
Wow.
talking about. Yeah, how much
I
it's
like the
just the
idea of
best.
holding on to nuggets too for later on.
Yep,
That's
right.
interesting of like the intentionality of that. That's not an accidental. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes I mean, and I know some people plot and plan, and other people sort of they follow the story, and all of that sort of happens um, as it does almost unconsciously. That's always
Mm.
fascinating to me how a story comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, then I made some notes. I wrote down some page numbers. I'd
I
like to
love
get through
it.
them if possible, but I
Let's
want to
do it.
start with two fun ones. On page 132, there's a reference to a goat on a boat, which I
Oh
remember
yeah.
a podcast episode a long time ago about something about goats on a boat. And page 190, use the phrase "grab in the bag," and
Yeah. Hmm.
even in the first book, there's "what's a nuka" is referenced, and I think one of the things that's fun as someone who's followed your work for a while is you see the loop backs and the meta
Hmm.
references and like, oh, just the throwback. But if you don't know it, it's fine. But to everyone,
Hmm.
it's like it's a very cool wink. And I
Like
thought
a
that,
wink.
yeah, just wink at someone real fast. And
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say that because when I was writing book one and Nord Heen's friend writes a play, and I was like, well, what's the play called? And when I had just published my play, What's a Nucka? And I was like, well, obviously it's called What's a Nucka. And I
mhm,
had this really, what is the word? Wobbly moment of,
wobbly.
wait, that's
Yeah.
Wobbly, wobbly. Like it's some sort of blend of vulnerable and hesitant. Wait, that's
Yeah.
so on the nose. It's so referential. It's so wink. Is that too cute? Is that like
Oh,
almost
I see.
silly? Or and I could feel NPR rolling its eyes, or like the as my son calls it, New York Times brain.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
all the smart people are gonna back away. Um, because come on. But there was a really interesting moment, like, no, this is how I do things. There was like a very interesting, yeah. Hmm.
So you had
Hmm.
like an actual internal hurdle. Like, how do I get over?
Yeah,
Do
it
I
was like
go
a
this way or
hesitation.
not?
Right, right. Because it was like if you, it was somehow, it's like, well, how does John, like questions you would ask somebody about your life, somebody who really was walking with you well would say, well, how does John do it? Like if you were
Right.
feeling, um, that is the question. Or like to your listeners, well, how do you do it? Do you go to work in the morning at 8 or 9 or 10, or do you go to work at 4 in the afternoon? Do you sleep during the day? Like
Right.
just take all the most basic, how many meals do you eat a day? Like when do you go out? Like you can go to the most granular things of life. How do you do it? Um,
Yeah.
well, I actually only like, your friend who's like, I actually have 3 outfits and I interchange them every 3 days. Like, I don't
Yeah.
like to have a lot of, okay, great. That's how you do it. So
Right.
you can do it from the most granular details of life all the way to the larger, how does John, and that's what we love. That's what we love it when somebody is somehow true to themselves and it
Hmm.
manifests in all the specific ways that person finds their way in the world.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that was like these things can be also become very existential. I remember working with a writer, and we were helping her get some clarity, and she kept saying, well, my editor says the book needs to be 70,000 words. And I said, well, how long is your book? And she's like, well, it needs to be 70,000 words. And I just kept repeating, but how long is your book? Um,
Right.
and as soon as she could see, oh, then this whole editor on her shoulder, and we freed her from 70,000 words, then she could get to the heart of the book quite quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a huge moment when I was like, oh yeah, this is a world within a world within a world with winks and nods and inside jokes, and everything is,
That's
there's a
awesome.
meta self-referential feedback loop. So let's just embrace it with us and let's just go all the way. It's like a double down on yourself.
Oh yeah, triple down even. Yeah. And I I think that that's actually kind of the scene that we love in a lot of movies or shows when a character, not to say breaks rank, but I understand what you mean. Like they decide all of a sudden to buck a part of the system that if they were to curtail to it, it would have been the annihilation of that character's
Yes.
interesting quirks, you know? And
Yes.
I like Soren Kierkegaard. He talks about one point. It's always the tallest blade of grass that gets cut first, and it's true. But how do we encourage people to keep growing in that capacity? Because it's also difficult to stand out. It's not exactly easy, but it is, somehow it feels more alive, more authentic, you know. Anyway,
Absolutely. It's the safest place to be, because even when you look back, it refigures and it reframes even things like failure and mistakes, which begin to dissolve as categories because you're
right.
just simply learning how to be you. How else would you learn? How
Yeah,
else
how
would
else
you
would you
learn?
learn? Uh, so speaking of learning, on I wrote down on page 122 to 123. Let me pull it up. It's right in the midst of that conversation about plumbing and being so good at it. I love that one. And I highlighted something if I felt like, oh, that's got a life punch to it. Like that's
Mm.
a wisdom in it. So that was your problem right there. What was my problem? You got good. I got good. You did. I done clogging clogs according to you. And I was like, oh, boom. What's wrong with being good at something? It's like when you're good at something, then people ask you to do it, and the next thing you'll be doing it. And the idea that Noon Ye, I don't know, she got stuck doing something for too long because she knew she was good at it. And if she had allowed herself to maybe not be good at it, then she could break rank with it and try something different. But I also just wrote down, it made me think of the Buddhist principle of the beginner's mind. Just never think you're an expert. Just always think you're a beginner. Yeah, just assume you have a lot more to learn and a lot more. Yeah,
Absolutely. Beginner's mind is that's if you're gonna have a goal, have that as your goal. That's
yeah.
been like, yeah, and I love how when Brigida shows up and
Oh
Nunez is
yes,
bored, I love when she shows up. It's the strangest conversation Nunez has
yeah,
ever had. I don't do cloggings anymore. Well, neither do I. What? Wait, what? What? Like it just from the get go, Brigida is like a step ahead, but also,
yeah,
yeah. Well, that's your problem right there. You got good at it. Like right from the get go, she's Nunez can sense that this is wisdom, but it's also so off kilter, and the cadence is so sort of
yeah.
rickety.
And but then that's the thing, is like some people would assume that to get good at something is the solution, and then here's the opposite. And I know that's actually your problem.
Yeah, a lot of the work I do with people, we expertise is both developmentally at different stages a wonderful thing to be working towards, a craft, a trade,
Oh
the
sure,
subtleties and
right.
nuances. But what I've noticed is lots of people, because I do these 2 days here in Ojai where people come and sit under the trees with me, the number of times when the expertise is actually what has the person jammed up because a season of life has ended
Yep.
and a new season, a new chapter wants to begin, but the person got good at something.
Yeah.
And so they're assuming that all of the skills of the previous chapter, or what they went to school with, or what they have their master's degree in, the muscles they built up, will all translate into the new chapter. Like, obviously, I'm an accountant, so I'll use all of this in the
Right.
next thing I'm doing. And what they actually want is beginner's mind. They actually want a new what's actually happening is they're being invited into something new where the game resets
Right.
and
Yeah.
and you'll retrieve whatever, and then you think about industrial revolution, you think about the addiction to productivity and efficiency in the modern late stage capitalism. How many people are like, if I went to school, if I went to culinary school, then I need to be a chef, or I've wasted
That's
that,
right.
as
Hmm.
opposed to, no, I went to culinary school because it lit me up and it was fascinating. I learned all kinds of things and it was what I was doing then.
Yeah.
Now I'm doing this.
Yeah. And
These
it's on.
ideas that anything that you leave behind you have wasted, as opposed to, no, it's kind of the definition of an interesting life.
Oh yeah. Um, Speaking of which, you just reminded me. There's a memory I have of my dad. He passed away in 2019, just before COVID. And there was one time we were sitting there all in the living room, and we're watching Indiana Jones. Okay, normal movie. Everybody watches that. And I think Harrison Ford at one point does a wheelie on a motorcycle. And my dad just sits there and he kind of whispers it. He's like, "Wheelies are hard." And and my brother and I, like, would you would you just say? It's like, "Oh, just wheelies are hard." He's like, "How do you know?" He's like, "I used to ride motorcycles." We're like, "What? We didn't know this." And so in the midst of watching this, we found out something. Like at that point, I was probably in my mid-20s. This is something I never knew about my dad, that he knew how to do wheelies on a motorcycle, which is more about the throttle than it is about pedaling and other things.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea that there's these hidden lives and that somehow they build up towards and include, I mean,
Yeah.
it's all that transcend and include thing all the time. Always keep transcending, but keep including the best of it.
Wow. That's so interesting that your dad had never told you about his motorcycle days.
Yeah. And they probably weren't super long, but it's like, are there any pictures of this? He's like, no. But you have to ride enough to finally be able to do a wheelie, you know? You're
Yeah.
you're doing
Yeah.
wheelies, you're probably comfortable on a motorcycle beyond a normal person.
Yes. Yes, you're at least at stage 2, maybe
You're,
stage 3.
that's right. That's right. So for Nunez to give up unclogging things, and man, some of the descriptions, I felt like I could kind of smell whatever that smell was whenever she's going into those pipes. That's just gross. But there's also uh, like when you change jobs, the way that I kind of describe it to people, it's like you're in the open ocean, and you're like, "This is great. I'm in a wide open ocean." And then you could also be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the wide open ocean." And so the same experience, kind of like what you said with the wobbliness, it's like it can be exhilarating and terrifying. You could be unsure and at the same time very sure that this is what you have to do. And I love I don't know, if characters don't have that kind of tension, they're not relatable.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it became very compelling to me as we follow her. She doesn't have any conditioning or programming. She doesn't have on her shoulder the voice of this is what should be happening at this time.
Oh, right.
She doesn't have patriarchy, like here's a woman, as a woman, here's what you can and can't do. She
Right.
doesn't have developmentally how far along she's supposed to be. Like when the girls are sitting, when she meets those girls who are sitting in a circle combing their hair, and she
It's
just has
exactly
all
what I
this
was
hatred
thinking.
because
Hmm.
they have this word normal. And she's like, I haven't heard that word normal, but she's like, but I know the energy of it. And
Yeah.
she's furious. She's so repulsed and reviles this idea that there's some way she's supposed to dress or supposed to. And that became really, really compelling to me. A character who doesn't, even the isolation and loneliness of the valley she grows up in, no one ever has told her you shouldn't be plumbing at 8
Right.
or you
Uh-huh.
should know how to read or write at this age. She's like wide open, just having experiences without templates that she's holding them up to.
Wow.
She's just, and that to me, especially with the number of, I just found it really, really compelling when you think about how many of us central to the human experience is unwinding the conditioning and programming,
Oh, yeah.
like the stuff that we are getting off, the voices we're getting off our shoulder or out of our head is like one
Yeah.
of the central works of health and healing and guidance and maturity and transcending and
Right.
including in life.
That's an
And
include.
she's just like doesn't, or she'll just say like, I don't know that word, what's that, but she can feel the energy of certain things, the story
Uh-huh.
underneath it.
So it also makes me wonder because every human being has that first naivete, the first
Yes.
innocence.
Yes.
So, but what's interesting, I guess, is Nunya carried that much longer into her life,
Right.
right? Because
And
we all
it's
have it
also
until like 4 or 5 years old. We start being like,
right.
oh, this is how you
Right.
use a swing set. Okay.
Yeah, right. So she's has this certain kind of innocence, but then she's also very smart, very intuitive, very ballsy, like the Chow Chow, like she's fearless and will go anywhere and do anything, and
Right.
also is kind of clueless, and
Mm.
it all just sits side by side, which I just think is it's just really interesting. Like you said, there's a tension there that's really interesting.
So then, is it fair to say that as you were writing this, you were always going leaning towards, all right, what would be the interesting thing here? Because uh, I know some people like to sit down and write out full outlines, but I kind of like the idea of letting the surprises happen and like the book will end how it does. Did you already have the end picture in
Yeah,
mind?
yeah. So for me, it's like a spell where I'm caught up in the story and almost like a millisecond delay between watching your favorite show and also you wrote and filmed your favorite show. You're creating it, but you're in it, following it, surprised and moved by what's happening, you also happen to be typing it. You also happen to be noticing it as it's unfolding. So there are things I know are going to happen, but
The beats.
there are beats and I'll know something's coming up, but I don't know how soon or how long it will take to get there.
Uh,
Or like right away, well, actually writing book one, I remember thinking about book two and her and knowing obviously the last line is okay, so we got something for you here. There's a guy named Hinger Bears. And I was like, how awesome would it be to tell this whole story and then to have her be a moment at the end when you first hear her Randy say,
yeah.
"Oh, this guy got and Furtis got in a jam. What's his name? Hinger Bears." I was like, I think that might be electric if you've read book one. And
Yeah.
then I got to the end of writing, and I'm like, oh, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm close. And then she's in the avocado grove, and she's by the pool, and she hears the click, and she goes and gets the little disc,
Yeah.
and typing that was like absolute, it was so like the best meal you've ever had.
Oh, that's good.
It was so, and I remember like typing, all right, Hinger Bears, let's see what you have for me, period, jumping up from the desk and just like, yes, yeah, just the exuberance, the like, done, done.
Hey.
Yeah, no, that's like, that is really, 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 really satisfying, really enjoyable. So yeah, sometimes I know where it's headed, and sometimes I mean, like I knew the book club scene. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
early on you get like, oh, everything has to blow up unresolved, all of it left hanging, just a nightmare, and then just fade to black, and then
Oh, yeah.
open up, and she's in a whole other place, and she's in a book club, and they're probably going to kick her out. Like some of that, you will just be like a very atmospheric, visceral. Oh yeah, that's what we're going to do. Got it. But that's sometimes it just comes in like that, and then you live with it for a while and start to get a sense of the flesh and blood of how to do that. Mm-hmm.
Um, on page 157, let me flip over. Another one that stood out to me was she's sitting at the table and she overhears the women having a conversation. And I want to say every human being who's ever been to a coffee shop has overheard some
Oh,
person being offended at something. Every
oh,
train ride I've ever taken into Philly, man. But the idea that I wondered how often offensive things happened to that woman because she let herself be offended.
yeah.
Wow. Not that that's, I mean, it is kind of mind blowing, but it also shouldn't have to be. But we kind of tether ourselves to too many things, and then we get the wrong kind of energy reacting to those things when we could be creative instead and using that energy on something else. Uh,
Well, think about your friend who constantly complains about the airlines. That friend gets their planes canceled more. Like they
yeah,
have more flight problems.
yeah,
The friend who is completely divorced from I'm going to go up in the sky in a metal tube where they're going to serve me
right,
food and I'm going to watch movies, and then the plane relatively gently is going to settle back on the earth, and what took my ancestors 3 months on a
yep,
horse will take me about 5 hours. Like
right, right.
uh so what how much of these things actually exist, and how much do the stories that we're telling and the perceptions we have of them shape what they even are? How
Shape
much
what
of
they are in the moment. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I've. It's almost impossible to do it, but I mean, today is currently election day,
yeah.
and I've been saying to some people near me that I think we're just exhausted because we don't know how to respond to it. And it's almost as though a little bit once this day happens or once an elector is chosen, whatever you want to say, then we can actually get to the action of responding to it. but I felt as though so many of the past months leading up to it have been reactive. And actually, I've quoted you a few times when you, in a podcast a while ago, said that the news can be like an endless outrage feedback loop. Man, I think I probably said that 20, 30 times in the past few
Yeah.
months.
Yeah. And you think about masses of people saying this is so tense. To what degree is it tense? And to what degree are you feeding and keeping in circulation the fact
Right,
that it is tense? And so the ever so subtle distinction between accurate observation of the events as they unfold
uh,
and feeding on them to the degree to which you are keeping it in play as that.
right,
And what's fascinating now is that what you click on, the internet, we create the internet by what we click on. And if I keep clicking on some of these things, then I'm telling the internet this is what I click on. And so the algorithm feeds
right,
it back to you. So even you think about this man, Donald Trump, he comes completely insane to show you how the algorithm works. He says Mexican rapist, and CNN helps elect him president in 2016
yeah,
because he knows they will print that and people will click on it and they will tweet it, their outrage, which
right.
will then mean it gets fed back to you. Like, you
Wow.
can see him as the end of democracy. You can also see him as he comes to reflect back to you.
Hmm.
So every single person who complains about the Kardashians, I would ask, how do you know about the Kardashians? What do you mean, how do you know? Well, everybody knows about the Kardashians. How does everybody know about the Kardashians? Well, they're like everywhere. Where? Well, the internet, Instagram, great. You clicked on the
Right.
internet and
Yeah.
told the internet, this is what I click on. So the internet went, okay,
Give you more
well,
of
then
it.
we're going to give you more of this. So this idea that the news is something out there, or that just name whatever thing people love to bash, Trump, the Kardashians, etc.,
Right.
you can see them as all that's wrong with the decline of Western civilization. And the degree to which that is true, you have to then park next to it. The people who click on this create it and then
Yeah.
bemoan its existence. it's a, it's like you can see it also as a great teacher to us. What you feed and what you click will then be fed back to you
Yeah.
energetically, algorithmically.
So then the coffee shop conversations. Sometimes I wonder, because there's a great coffee shop by me that is it's French themed, and so all the baristas I think are from France. They speak in French and they play French music. It's really kind of
Oh,
like
wonderful.
this is a real croissant because like this person
Yes,
actually used to live in
croissant.
croissant. Yeah. And
Croissant.
I think I like it because it's quiet and it's not one of those places where people show up with their laptops and then
Yeah.
sit there and then gawk about whatever news. I'm like, oh, actually, here's a place where people come not to gossip or to react. They're actually here for a really good mocha, and it's kind of nice. That's
Yeah,
all.
yeah, yeah. Isn't it fascinating how the architecture
Yeah,
shifts? So you can take, okay, so take your average pharmacy, drugstore,
yeah.
Walgreens, Rite Aid, etc., and fluorescent lighting, no windows. So it's
Hmm.
completely divorced from whether the sun is out or not. Um, Lots of things in the store will be in a landfill in 3 months. The footprint of the building and the architectural aesthetic of it is the same from city to city to city. It's absolutely irrespective of the
Right.
history, the geography, the temperature, the climate of the setting because it's cheaper just to put up that same square.
Yeah.
So you think of standing in the middle of a store, and then there are magazines when you come in that are about whoever's just hooked up with whoever, but those magazines will all swap out for different celebrities, um,
Yeah.
and what they're up to. And then you think about you and I standing in the middle of a place like that and saying, all is well.
Right.
It's good to be John. It's good to be
Yeah.
Rob.
Yeah.
You think about quoting the great poet Rilke, to be here is glorious. But then
Yeah.
you and I go, there's a bakery down the street from my studio here. It's outdoors. There are tables under this massive oak tree. There's a little stucco hut where you can get your coffee, your wine, and buy a loaf of bread.
Oh wow.
In the evenings, they do these chicken dinners. There are lights strung under the oak tree. And you and I sit there. It's good to be John. It's good to be Rob.
Right.
All is well. And you think about the two sites architecturally, uh, saying things like that in the one setting kind of sounds like gibberish. And in the
Yeah.
other setting,
That's true.
sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing to say, that the architecture
Wow.
is profoundly shaping, it's
How
existential
people
on
are
some level.
thinking, how they're
Yes.
experiencing things.
And that, like that place that you're talking about, that French coffee shop, it's like communicating almost from when you, I assume, walk through the door. This is what we do here. This is what it means to be human. This is what this is for.
Yeah. Well, and the
Isn't that
tables are
fascinating?
spaced out almost
Yes.
3 times more spaced out than they would be anywhere else, which would be like, let's get as many people in as possible. This is a
Right.
place where if you don't get there before noon or before, like, let's say 11, you probably won't find a chair till at least 2. But it's funny because there's only 15 chairs in there. And it's
Yes.
a
So
big
you,
space too.
yes.
Like you
Yes,
will
so that
not
you,
have to worry about bumping into someone with your elbow as you walk
right.
past their table.
Oh, and then you think about the economies of scale and how the owners, we would rather do this and do this well and do this for a
Yeah.
long period of time, and we will trust that our intention and the joy of doing this, what we do, is its own economic security, and we don't need to get
Mhm.
maximum tables per square footage.
Yeah.
We're playing a slightly different game here. That's fun. That's, yeah.
Is there a Barnes and Noble near you too? The bookstore?
The town I live in doesn't do. There aren't any chain in Ojai. There aren't any chains.
Oh,
You
okay.
can't have a franchise or a chain. So I'd have to go
Yeah.
30 minutes away, 35 minutes away.
Well, they were just becoming more and more brick and mortar, and in competition with online sales, stores were starting to go the way of Borders, which closed everywhere. But Barnes and Noble, a number of months ago, put out a statement saying that we recognize one of the things that makes bookstores great is that they take on the character of their environment or their neighborhood or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so they actually said, we are giving over designing reins to each of
good.
the local locations.
Yeah,
And it was interesting because I think for a while you could walk into a Barnes and Noble and it feel soulless. Like it feels just like
yeah,
every other one of them.
yeah,
But
yeah.
at least the one by me, like the carpet changed, things are starting to move a little bit, and it's just kind of interesting
Oh,
because it's actually
interesting.
increased traffic. Now it's actually kind of busy. And I mean,
Oh,
I
that's
kind of
awesome.
see this kind of goes back to Nunier, but that whole thing about personhood and identity and being unique, she's kind of discovering that all for herself, but she doesn't have those lines put on top of her like how Barnes Noble did for a bit in its stores.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
right, right, right. She
yeah,
just has her experience and her own sense of how it feels, whether it feels right or not. She
yeah.
has, yeah. And art, they talk about thisness. Some things have a very high thisness.
Uh huh.
And you're describing Barnes and Noble going, our bookstores have lost the thisness. So how do we reclaim thisness? Well, let's turn it over to people, and in that place, in that geographic place, we'll have those people discern and
Yeah,
sort out what that store is going to be. And all of a sudden, just even small bits of thisness begin to emerge. And you go, I think more people are actually coming. Of course. Of course.
And then was with Rogrito. I wasn't sure
Oh,
how to pronounce it,
yeah.
but I mean her
Rogrito.
and her first, I guess, kind of romance that kind of was betrayed, and
Whew. Whew.
but then I think it's later on after that she talks about she meets a few other guys, but always has a kill switch.
Yeah.
And just the word kill switch, that's I mean, that's some strong vocabulary. And thinking about how certainly you can go into life with a certain naivete and like, oh, this can work out, this is good. And then it burns you. And then you never want to go down that road again.
Oh, and even her
Ever.
narration as she's realizing that with Rogrito, something very powerful is almost like overtaking her. Like she's getting
Yeah. Elect-
pulled into this vortex, this full-bodied vortex, and she's narrating it for you, and you, the like watching her, you're like, ooh, this is probably not
and not going to be good.
good. And well, just that dread of like, oh, and then that feeling, she's like carrying it around with her, and she's like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, not doing that again. Not
Which
doing that again.
so that also made me think back to the first book because with Heen, and then they go into that area where it was a redesigned plain in a valley, and maybe they have a romance bit right there. I'm kind of curious what what she's going to rediscover about herself moving forward because we meet people sometimes and they unlock something in us that we had
Yeah,
closed off for a long time.
yeah,
So I'm assuming there's going to be a book 3, and I hope that there is. But man,
yeah. There and it was really interesting to me as you see what she goes through. She is finding Heen. She keeps projecting Heen. She's like, "Oh, you are in deep. You series 5. I've never seen
yeah,
someone as deep as you." But she is saying it as she is getting pulled. She's
yeah,
finds him like when they're at dinner, and she's like, "People actually like you. They like really like you. Like that's so interesting." She's she's finding something about him, so there's something, it's like being reignited in her, but she's just like the brakes are on.
yeah.
Like, but she can't help, there is some sort of something between them, but it's not the Rogrito. She certainly isn't like, oh my god, the first
Hmm.
time I saw Heen I was
Right.
crazy. And yet they're having breakfast at his place or dinner, and you're like, or when they go to that dinner in the bowl and they're having just genuine, like, it's like a first date, but no one's going to say that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
almost like, how do you work your way back into something? Well, gradually might be one of the answers. Yeah.
Did you have a like a person in mind when you wrote Rodrigo?
No, if I would ever to have somebody in mind, then the story immediately goes dead. I
Really?
any semblance to any, what's it say at the beginning of a book? Any
Wow.
resemblance to actual characters.
Right. Is
The
accidental or not planned?
but my family barely, like, Kristen has read both books, and she'll be like, it's not even in really, I don't think it's even that enjoyable for her, because she's like, oh, I see where you get all this. And like one of my kids was like, yeah, I'm
Oh,
not reading
really?
them because if I start to read them, I just, I know you too well, Dad. So I just know where all this comes from. I
Wow.
can't, to me,
Huh.
it's all 100% fresh, and it's not referring to any, once in a while I'll be like, oh yeah, obviously I know where I got that joke. But
Yeah.
it only works to sort of be caught up in it and just be like, it's almost like a very bordered beginner's mind, second naivete. It's
Yes.
obviously all coming out of me, but I almost have to complete it, like that all goes away, and I'm just on the planet Meads, and who is Rogrito, and it's all 100% fresh and new.
Right.
um, and then later, that's why it's so different than all of the previous books I wrote doing interviews, because talking to you is weirdly helping me on, it's like helping me see it. Like my previous life
Mm,
and work and books were like, this
right,
is what I'm saying, this is what I'm explaining. Here's a Hebrew word for it.
right.
Here's where I got it. Here's how I think about it. Here's how you could try this. Here's how it applies. Here's what I just said slightly differently. Chapter 5. Here's another way to see it, but
Yeah.
here's what it is. In case you were fuzzy, here are 3 more ways to see it. Um,
Oh,
so the interview becomes, what did you mean by this? Well, I kind of told you everything. I mean, in the old, in earlier Rob, an interview becomes, what do you mean by this? Can you say more? Actually, everything I had to say I put in the book, but I probably could say a
oh,
couple more things.
yeah, yeah.
Whereas this becomes, I don't know. I don't know what it's about. I
That's
wasn't
so
trying
much
to
more
make any
interesting.
points. I don't know where it comes from.
Yeah.
So that's why I like talking to you. It just endlessly is interesting.
Oh, that's
Because
great.
I'm like,
That's really
like,
nice. Well, it's and this can be the last reference from the book. But on page 380 was a single sentence that just, I mean, it punched me. It did. I read it and I was like, oh, because it just explained an whole era of my life.
mm,
And so on there, it's just a single sentence. Wad, uh, the mythologies work harder than we ever could.
yeah,
And I just was like, I had to close it and sit and look at the sunset for a while. And like, oh my
yeah,
gosh. And
yeah.
I mean, part of it's because I too went to seminary and I worked in churches for 15 years, 20 years. And I was, for a time, trying to be ordained and become a pastor. But I kept kind of running into obstacles because I'd want to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more. I love like the dark night of the soul, all that type of stuff. And that's very
Mm,
freaky to some people because, anyways, so I left that and now I kind of do professor work and I actually really enjoy doing spiritual direction with people. And
yeah.
spiritual direction to me is so much about letting people have their own compass and just you're there to help them read their compass, but not tell
Yes,
them what
yes.
you see on their compass.
Yeah,
And
right, right, right.
it still scratches the pastoral itch in me, but it doesn't have that burden of constantly explaining things. It's so much more about
Yes,
let's be present. Like what's this moment sharing? Like
yes, yes,
let's go
yes.
find the flow in the midst of all of this. And I think I say all that because the churches I had worked at, in my mind, the senior pastors were chronic overworkers and trying to work against the internal stories that other people had. And you can run yourself on a treadmill trying to give people a better story or tell people how their story is wrong. And I'm just like, no, you just gotta just let it go. Just you can have a story and you can share your understanding of the story, but give up the need to convince people that your story is better than theirs and just kind of like the French coffee shop, like you got to trust the environment. You got to trust that man, love is baked into the whole thing. And if you can just stop disbelieving the love,
Yes,
it's going to be fine. All's going to be well. Just chill out.
yes.
So that's why I say it kind of like named a decade and a half of experience.
Mm,
The mythologies will always outwork us. So we got to play by different rules then. That's all.
yes. Yeah, yeah. Trusting that a human being has their own deep knowing,
Right.
and to sit with somebody, we the way that we help each other is not by hijacking each other's deep knowing. Think about my kids always joke
Hijacking
about,
their deep knowing.
yeah, some
That's a
my
good line.
kids would joke about, like, okay, boomer, anytime someone is like, okay, so here's what you should do. Here's what you should do. My kids would just laugh and be like, okay, boomer. Like a whole generation just goes around like, I told them, I gave them my advice. You're like, oh
Yeah.
my God.
Right.
No, we sit with each other. This work I do here in Ojai, when people come and sit with me, people know. They
Right.
know.
Right.
And the farming out of our intuition is, in
Wow.
some ways, the central crisis of the moment. And you can see how many people, I mean, think about how many women were for years going, I don't think the system is sustainable. I think this is going off the
Yeah.
rails. I
That's
think,
true.
wait, the US is the largest arms dealer in the history of human civilization and also happens to have mass shootings all the time. I think those are all connected.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and think of just how many women intuitively were like, this is not sustainable. And when they voiced that knowing, somebody in charge, usually a man, was like, we got this. And then it did go off the cliff, or it did go off the rails. How many people right now are going, wait a second, I knew this, I
Yeah.
saw this,
Right.
and
Right.
you told me we were fine and we weren't, and I am going to trust this. So you think about intuition, embodiment, you think about how deep knowing, the silent stillness out of
Yeah.
which all things actually arise. You 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 just watch right now how many people are discovering that your true nature is peace. There is a deep knowing,
Yeah.
and
That's like
so then
Rupert Spira.
gradually, like, pardon?
That sounds like Rupert Spira.
I mean, you think about, I mean, literally, like if you were to talk to people who study the planets, they would be like, yes, we're ending an entire age and moving into what they would call the Aquarian age. We're moving into an entirely new way of being in the world. And what you're seeing right now with the
Oh,
great tumult all around us is the ending of energies. And those fundamental energies were, how do I manage my own internal chaos by controlling my external environment? So the
yes.
dominant
Right.
way, like the generation you and I were raised with, the dominant energies were, let me get in your business. That's how I deal with my own.
Yeah.
And you can see how many people are like, actually, I'm paying attention to my interiors and doing that. And that ripples outwards in all kinds of
Yeah.
ways.
Right.
Yeah, it is a great turning of the ages. So what's fascinating about you is you were the son of those institutions that were like, tell you what,
Sure. Yeah.
tell you what, we would gladly systematically hijack your own deep knowing because we got a whole thing that you need to do.
Yeah.
And then you move to, tell you what, I'll sit with you. Let's listen. You talk. I'll ask you questions.
It's exactly
Let's
what
see
I do.
what emerges.
Yeah.
I'll hold up a mirror, reflect back to you what I'm seeing. That will be the gift I give you. Sounds like, does that sound about right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and the funny thing, maybe it's not even funny. It's something else. But I finish those calls and I wrap them up and I write an email back to them and I highlight all the notes that I took and try to help them
Wow.
figure out their next right step. That's always the
Yes.
ending question
Love
at
it.
the end of our time.
Love it. Love it.
Uh, and I don't feel drained.
Oh,
You know what I mean? It's
right.
like, oh,
Oh,
I'm tired
absolutely.
because I just actively listened for an hour and a
Good
half or
tired. It's
whatever.
good tired. It's
It's the
like,
Tove tired, is what we
yes,
call it.
yes, yes,
And
yes.
but I like the idea that there's a shift that's currently happening.
Absolutely.
Every time there's a shift forward, there's people that want to pull back into the known understanding and ordering and arrangement.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm,
that's
mm-hmm.
kind of normal, but I I I love the idea of a future where people are more intuitive and listening and holistically aware of their own internal compass. That sounds exciting.
Absolutely.
Who knows what that could look like, but that I think on the whole that could look pretty good.
Well, what's fascinating is the the immediate pushback is generally something like, you can't just have everybody listening to you'll have chaos. Uh, no. What's interesting is people tends to create greater intimacy because I have set aside my agenda for you. So I'm
Oh,
actually
that's
seeing
true.
you and listening.
Yep.
So you end up with people having far greater trust and connection with each other. You also have way more truth telling among people because you
Mhm.
just, in your own curiosity, what do you think about that? What you just said? Well, you're just asking questions, which
Right.
gets way quicker. Do you get to the heart? And how did that feel? It felt miserable. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So we've established that when you move that way, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Um, it actually calms everybody's nervous systems down because I'm not having to protect myself against you coming in with all of your. I
Well,
actually sense that you're simply seeing me. I mean, think about structural injustice.
yeah.
Think about throwing rocks at police officers in the street or whatever the structural clash.
Hmm.
If you trace it back, probably if you went way, 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 way back, there was some injustice and somebody went, does anybody see this? My
Mm.
brother was
Yeah.
shot down by a cop on the sidewalk. There literally wasn't, they turned off the power because the grid was built for profit, not to take care of people in ice storms in Texas, whatever it is.
Or
And nobody saw. And when an injustice or some sort of oppression isn't witnessed, you get angry.
yeah. Right.
And like you think about the witnessing of it, when somebody sees it,
Mm.
that's a big chunk of it right there. And when it goes unseen, you get angry. Then remember in the 80s when the vice president's 90s, Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore, did like a thing against rap lyrics.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a whole,
At
we
the
need to have a
censoring of
parental
it.
advisory sticker.
Yeah.
This music is so foul, et cetera, et cetera. But what's fascinating is what are the conditions that would lead somebody to rap about that?
Right. Uh huh.
Like you can
Uh
put
huh.
a sticker on it,
Yeah.
but there's a whole other set of questions is what is it like to be in a moment, a scene, a culture that is disintegrating and you
Oh, yeah.
give that expression? Like, how did that happen?
Well, and I'm not sure if when we talked about a year ago, I shared this, and then we can wrap it up. But I was sitting in my office and I was looking out the window, and I was just trying to think of the opposite word for integrity. I was like, what's a lack of integrity? I was like, unintegrity, detegrity. I was like, disintegrity. I was like, disintegrated.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And
Oh,
so,
nice. Right.
I mean, I love doing etymological work. You pay attention to these words, and they have fireworks in them.
Yes.
And but that whole idea of separating and parsing and dividing and making distinctions, things can have their identity, their thisness, but if we can get back to some sense of integration, integrate,
Yes.
I think that that's probably, maybe you can speak to it, maybe that's what the next shift is. Maybe if you already see it in your kids, maybe that's what the boomers, with their good intentions, tried to make up some distinctions and try to order the world. But let's be honest, Jurassic Park was right. Life will find a way, you know?
Yeah,
So,
they even call it, they call it the when in the relation to how the planets work, people call it the cross of planning. A generation,
cross of planning.
the cross of planning, which is almost like an addiction to building and making plans and controlling the outcomes, which
Oh,
inevitably gets a person disconnected from their heart. So, whatever you do, just build another strip mall. Whatever you do, just make another chain coffee shop. Just,
yeah.
and as opposed to listening, pause, stillness, silence, uh, what do we want to do next? What would that look like? Yeah, yeah.
Does does it excite you that your books Your science fiction books lead to conversations like this?
Well, what's fascinating, it's funny because, like, let me think. This week, a psychoanalyst from Chicago, a writer from London, a a comedian from England, a
What?
tarot card witch from Netherlands, a um, and we will a guy who runs an art collective in North Carolina. The interviews a spiritual director in Australia.
Yeah.
It is 1 minute in, and oftentimes I'm just meeting the person like this on like
Yeah.
a Zoom kind of thing, and we're into economics, we're into our parents, we're into death, loss, joy, we're into
Yeah.
coffee, we're into political strife, we're into yeah, the psychology, the psyche, psychoanalysis, we're into the physiology of the nervous system. We're all over it's that it's like yeah, oh, you would appreciate this perhaps. Uh, the last book, one of the interviews was with like a kind of self-help motivational
Yeah.
woman,
Uh-huh.
kind of guru-ish, and she said, honestly, she said, I don't read fiction. I only read self-help.
Interesting.
And I was like, well, tell me more about that. And she was like, well, I always assumed fiction was like a step down. It's like not serious.
Oh, wow.
So for her, there's work, there's literature, there are books that help you, that give you
And then there's
tangible advice
everything
on
else
how to
that
get
doesn't.
better. And then there's people who are almost like People Magazine, like people who are just sort of silly, like the checkout at
Mhm.
the grocery store is sort of a story. And she's like, I don't quite know what happened because I read your book and I don't. So the interview was about her realizing the story took her like
Wow.
into
Yeah.
dimensions of her life and her navigating the world. It like opened up all the stuff, and she had like, wait, this, what even is this? Because this isn't serious. This is just like some ridiculous story on a different planet. But it like
Oh,
just went like stories do.
yeah, it got
They
right
go,
to her.
they go, they go right in.
That's good.
Isn't that fascinating? But I loved it.
Yes.
I loved how she was like, oh, I have like a first and second and third class sort of the ways that you spend your
Oh, wow.
time and just a story. And it's just funny that this modern system would produce that as opposed to you and I going, yeah, no stories from the get-go.
Yeah.
We're always how you got to the real stuff.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
guy climbed a hill, lady had a baby, like lady built a business, guy lost his son, like like those start with a story and that's how you get in find your way into stuff.
And I believe it's Pete Rollins a long time ago. He convinced me that stories are a technology for transformation. That's good. All right, Rob. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. I
Dude,
hope
I
you
love talking to you.
hope it's
I love it.
good. It's good to be Rob. It's good to be
That's
John.
sure looks like it's good to be John.
Yeah. And is it the best to get this from your personal website,
Yeah, that's
robbell.com?
great.
Yeah.
Sure. Love it.
And I finished the last one by saying I hope you write an octology, and I'm glad if you want to do part three, that'd be fun too. So we'll
Okay,
see.
good. Good.
Thank you for your time so much. Yeah.
Wonderful. It's just great.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.